Hi, everyone. Thanks again for watching the next installment in the series or reading it, if that's how you're consuming it. My name's Hugo Cassidy, a partner at Pinsent Masons.
And I'm Luke McKinney, Director of Consulting at Nile.
So you will remember that in the last installment of the series, we were talking about the siloed faithful model as an approach to embedding an innovation function within a business. And we talked about some of the pros and cons of that approach. We're now going to talk about the third model that we're going to discuss in this series, the embedded expert model. Luke, do you want to just talk a little bit about what that is?
I can indeed. So this is probably one of the more ambitious models that we say to do right and to do properly and to see the benefit from. So this is where you really want to embed the skills and capabilities required in an innovation or digital function within every single business area, overseen by a very clear culture and strategy. So rather than kind of setting up a business silo to house this expertise, you ensure that every business area has this expertise embedded and can innovate in their own way, directly related to their subject matter expertise. So this is one that we see is extremely valuable, because what you start to see is technical user experience expertise start to specialize, either based on the function of an area. So it could be, I'll take an example. We both do a lot of work within financial services. So if you look at banking, suddenly you have deep subject matter expertise within what it means to build a digital mortgages product or a digital trade finance product. So these very, very complex areas within a regulated industry suddenly start to have a much wider range of possibilities, moving beyond just kind of simple digitization or lift and lay recreations of what already exists in the paper-based world, but in a digital format. So we find this model, when done right, can be extremely effective, and these teams tend to come up with not that more innovative is really a word, but definitely the range of solutions and ideas and opportunities that come out of teams that are set up in this way, just because of that constant exposure to the deep subject matter expertise, is so much greater. So we tend to see, like, if you're going after this model, it works in a couple of ways. So first and foremost, it's great, as I say, in regulated environments where challenges are particularly complex. So again, all of the simple stuff in my mind has been digitized a long time ago. If you want to buy a widget on the internet, the patterns are well and truly known. If you're trying to digitize something that has never existed before in a digital format, or automate something that's never been automated before, you have whole heaps of wicked challenges that come out with that as well. So if you're reliant on that unique specialist knowledge that exists within business functions, it becomes key. This is where I'd probably add over another layer. So we've mentioned it a little bit before in some of the earlier episodes where we talked about generative AI. And generative AI is a technology that this model lends itself really well to. So like the one thing that we see probably tripping up teams that most is the people who are experts in generative AI are not experts in the fields that we're trying to deploy a generative AI solution. And without that deep subject matter expertise, it's very difficult to get the benefit out of that technology. The other area this works really well on is if there is a very clear strategy that helps guide the innovation digital pipelines of different business areas as it currently exists, making sure that teams have time and space, and that these experts that are kind of embedded within the teams just don't get swamped by business as usual activities and actually have the ability to think about complex challenges in different ways. And probably the third and probably most important benefit we've seen with this model is scale. So it becomes a lot easier within that process where you understand a business area very, very intimately to scale up initiatives within that business area and within a specific customer base within that. So there's probably the three benefits. I really like this model. If you probably can't tell, that is the practitioner in me. So it is kind of an idealized one to actually do this. We have it is expensive because you're essentially repeating what feels like expertise in different teams. But the quality of outputs is definitely traded off on that, and the ultimate impact that you can have as a business, I feel, depending on whatever economy we might be in, is definitely beneficial. But yeah, have you seen much of this in the legal space?
Yeah, I have. I mean, actually, I'd say this is the closest model to what we've got at
Mhm.
Pinsent Masons. And I think this came across really well in what you were describing. But this is, let's be clear, this isn't a call to action to everyone in a team or a practice group to become innovators. This is embedding the innovation team, the people who are tasked with
Yes.
doing things differently, in close proximity, geographically or in working practices, with particular teams. So they're not sitting apart in an innovation function that serves the whole business. You have, for example, a team that might specialize in a particular area of law, and they sit really closely with the practitioners of that area of law. So, yeah, so I'd say this is the closest to what we've got at PM at the moment. So, I think the journey started for us as an innovation function which was closely aligned with a particular team, and it was one. So it was more of a speedboat, and we talked about that in the
Mm.
second installment in the series. And the business, having seen that speedboat successfully complete the journey of setting it up and executing matters and doing things differently, took the deliberate step of embedding that innovation model. We call them advanced delivery teams in each of our four practice groups, each of which represents a grouping of expertise, for example, disputes or corporate advisory and so on. So in our version of this embedded expert model, each team is comprised of lawyers supported by a non-lawyer product expert. Now, people may be going, well, hold on. why, why have you embedded lawyers within legal teams to execute innovation when it seems to be that lawyers aren't able to drive this through? They struggle to do it. And I think the answer to that is really simple, which is it comes down to you need people who can understand the legal context in which those practice teams are operating in order to take those issues or objectives from clients and then work with technology teams to translate them into products and solutions. So it's a very deliberate strategy, and it's not one that was done just because there were lawyers on the payroll. So you've got these lawyer teams, and the task of those teams is to act as what we call the fusion team between the legal subject matter experts on the one side and the technology and the IT SMEs on the other. I recently described, I think it's going to catch on, but I recently described our team as an emulsifier, sort of the fairy liquid of the looking up world, helping to get the oil and water of legal and technology to mix together rather than sort of sitting separately in a vessel. I'm not sure that's going to catch on.
That is a great chemistry reference.
Indeed. So I completely agree with you. For where the business is at the moment, I think that this is absolutely the right model. And we'll come on to, actually it's not just, you don't have to choose one or the other and go with all the characteristics of that model. You can somehow take elements of that and try to make sure that the benefits of, for example, a siloed faithful model can be added to an embedded expert model and try and get the best of both worlds, delicate balance. But I think that as journeys mature, that is what you will start to see. That's just kind of Darwinian evolution when it comes to innovation functions in practice. Now,
that's a very fair point. I rarely see a thoroughbred one of these models. There's always a little bit of tweaking depending on a specific organization, its culture, its needs, strategic intent at that given time. But yeah, I'm very supportive of mixing definitely different skill sets. So, having that deep expertise of the lawyers, but then kind of bringing in other expertise or other capabilities that think differently and kind of challenge. I think that's it's also why I'm very, very supportive of like junior members in a team. because I feel there's something about being inexperienced that allows you to ask stupid questions that aren't actually that stupid. So why are we doing it this way? After 20 years of doing the same task, you kind of just get hardened in certain ways and forget to ask these things. So, yeah, not just skill set, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Also, kind of thinking about tenure and, ability to kind of approach a problem from a different way and not worry too much about it. And again, that comes down to culture, because if you have junior folks coming in that don't feel that they can challenge the norm or the status quo, then suddenly you don't get the benefit of that different perspective.
I
But yeah,
completely agree. But I'm seeing that where this works well, yes, you've got the juniors there, they're asking the right questions, but you do need that senior stakeholder heft to make sure that that team is getting the traction within the group in which they've been embedded. So hopefully that network is already there and you're kind of building on existing relationships. But if not, you need that heft to be able to get in front of senior stakeholders, get in front of clients and talk credibly about the proposition. And so you need those juniors coming up who are bringing out those skills, because this is a really distinct skill set. And it's something that I don't think works that well part-time. So I used to, in a former life, be a banking lawyer full-time. I now do only banking law to the extent I'm doing it where there's a tech-led or tech-enhanced element to it, because this is a full-time role with its own skill sets and disciplines. So you need, I think, those seniors there to make the proposition work. But I'd say completely agree with you about the mindset and open sort of open mindset.
That is definitely one that we described as kind of like a little bit of a watch out with this model particularly. So we describe it as kind of like business as usual creep. So essentially this model starts to fall down as soon as that kind of embedded expert team just gets put to use to, on kind of just operational problems. So, and that becomes really difficult because then essentially like you have a specialist skill set potentially just, not really pushing growth, but just kind of maintaining the current delivery. And that is like a difficult line to draw within this model that we've seen. So, if everyone's job within a business area is growth, then arguably, this business as usual activity is helping us grow. And it's like, well, is it really? So that line can become a little bit blurred. And if you don't kind of help and have a toolkit framework in place to allow teams to navigate and make those decisions, you're just at risk of wasting a lot of money and resource kind of trying to bring this expertise into a specific business area.
Could not agree more. So BAU creep, the idea that instead of doing new stuff or pushing the envelope and doing things differently, you just kind of end up backfilling BAU work because you have, I guess, by trying not to do that work, you sometimes have periods where maybe you're less busy or for whatever reason, you can then end up staffing yourself onto these transactions and not completing your objectives at all. I don't know, I'm probably biased. I think that people who put themselves forward to serve in innovation functions are self-selectingly helpful by nature. It's I always call it a collaboration model. You can't innovate in isolation. You need to be able to work with a network to get people to buy into the proposition and to work with you. But then if you are inherently and self-selectingly helpful and radical collaborator, your instinct is always to say, yes, we'll do that. Whereas actually sometimes the answer should be no. If we do that, that will mean we can't then really further the objectives of what this team is about in changing the way that the firm or the business does a particular activity. And that's when actually a bit of senior stakeholder coordination goes an awful long way, because that's a senior level conversation.
Definitely. Yeah. It's very much about that coordination and deployment of the teams and like not necessarily the roadmap, but at least the kind of the priorities of what we're working on. And that kind of division of labor, the things that we find that are particularly effective, to your point around senior leadership oversight, planning, and structure. That is essential within this space. And if that is not very proactive and very on it, like as soon as it becomes crunchy from a business as usual perspective or a delivery perspective, everyone kind of disappears into other roles, and you don't get the benefit. The other thing we find that helps. So again, if you've got these kind of specialist skill sets embedded within other teams, we find that it can be a little bit draining. This is why, we find a lot of these skill sets love the speedboat model, because they essentially just get to hang out with people who think like them all of the time. If you're in a business, particularly if you're in like a older school enterprise organization that has been there for many years, and many of the people in the teams have been there for many of those years, they will speak a completely different language, they'll have a completely different view of the world, potentially. Not that it's wrong, it's just that it is informed by a different set of expertise, which you need to be able to collaborate with. But this can be quite tough for teams, and you need to be able to, one, create a culture where both those skill sets can come together and be the emulsifier to steal your your slogan. I'm going to help that one catch on. So creating a little bit of crossover between that is like, so internal forums, kind of best practice meetups, these types of kind of cultural things. You also need to be careful with these too, because if they just become like, all of kind of the designers, developers, tech people coming together and just having a moan about the rest of the organization, it can actually just solidify the wrong culture. So again, it's thinking very much about like, how do you keep these interactions positive, and understand that, the subject matter expertise that exists within people who have been in the organization with a very different skill set, who are ultimately the core business, can help this more innovative kind of cadre of other folks.
That empathy point is so important. If you go into this role with the view that everything is capable of being revolutionized, and everyone who's not fully for it is, a sort of technological backslider and a Luddite, well, you're just going to annoy a lot of people. And actually, in this radical collaboration model, which I think these innovation functions need, listening is probably the most important skill you can have, then followed by a bit of creative thought and teamwork. But if you're not listening, you're going to struggle, I think, to generate that buy-in to what you're doing, and the trust that you're actually listening to the problems that the business wishes to solve and the clients wish to solve. I love the governance point as well, Luke, because again, this is what you can see if you have a bunch of embedded experts in a business operating in, maybe not silos, but sort of pockets of activity, maybe answerable to those particular groups. You may see loads of great ideas coming through and loads of demand on technology and IT teams to build out solutions and build out products. But without effective prioritization, resource allocation, and some level of process to make sure that all happens, and that things that can't actually be served are not deprioritized, such as just clear that the business can't serve them, you can end up in a bit of a situation where people are shouting to be served, and you either get stuff that simply isn't being done, or things being reprioritized, or things being dropped. So it's really important where you have these teams that are essentially competing for scarce resource, that there is some level of central oversight about how that resource is allocated, typically using some level of objective scoring based on revenue, pricing, gross margin, efficiencies gained, those sorts of things, so that there's some objective standard to it.
Yeah. Other ones that we have seen for that process, essentially, I don't want to use the term Dragon's Den, but it definitely, like, we have definitely seen kind of ex-code Dragon's Den type committees that are kind of brought together for these innovation projects, and something you have like different business areas pitching, which actually I don't mind as a format. I quite like it, just because it gives one variety, but two, it also it also tells you it's happening high enough up in the organization that's being taken seriously. Two, it's happening high enough up in an organization so there is a link with like the wider priorities and strategic vision of the organization. And two, a little bit of competition internally is good around this stuff, because if you can't compete internally, you're never going to compete in the market when it comes to this type of proposition development innovation. So I like to see it. It's quite a good format. And you definitely get a good mix of ideas.
I agree with that. I think that if and the sort of innovation steerco, let's call it, who is responsible for prioritizing and governing whether something gets greenlit, isn't saying no enough, it's probably not working as well as it might, right? Because there are some great ideas out there, but are they worth it, or are they better value than the other ideas? So if no isn't a word that's coming out, and that can be very difficult if someone's really attached to an idea and really thinks it's fantastic and the effort will be rewarded. Actually, that's quite a difficult message, particularly if it's coming from a senior stakeholder within the business. So that can be one that needs diplomatic managing, but I think it's essential to the functioning of this to make sure that
the funding model around that is also quite, because I find a lot of organizations are quite willing to fund proof of concepts, but to actually fund implementations tends to go the other way. And again, if there's a proper kind of scaled up implementation, more often than not, it tends to revolve around business as usual rather than building something new. Don't get me wrong, I've worked on plenty of exceptions of that over the years, but as a trend that tends to focus. I suppose there's one other watch out that I would kind of call out with this model, because I've definitely seen it a couple of times where organizations have essentially just decided to rebrand existing staff with very BAU skill sets into digital or innovation experts. So don't get me wrong, it is much easier to reprint business cards than it is to actually train teams. But to do this properly, you do need to be bringing in, well, one, people with the right expertise from a discipline perspective, but then also from an experience perspective, as in they've been around the block and they've done this a few times. Because otherwise, what we tend to see with the rebranding issue is, one, there's normally a period of mass confusion where no one really understands what their new job role is or what they should do. So they just continue with their previous job role and you don't see any change or impact. Next is normally that those individuals are at a level where they don't actually have either the remit or the accountability to push things in a new or different way. So even those that probably are more kind of aligned and kind of can see new solutions or new way of doing things, they're not in a position to kind of argue that upstream. That's the other thing that we used to always insist on kind of like our programs is like, can we get someone who's like relatively fresh off the front line, if not already still working there? So, bringing someone in who's working in the contact center, working in a branch, working, directly with customers, because they are the ones that have a very good idea of what will work and what won't work. And then everyone moves up organizations and you tend to get to a middle bit where it's maybe been about 10 years since you've had to have direct conversations with the customer on a day-to-day basis, and suddenly and you have KPIs that sit over here, and suddenly like your prioritization starts to shift a little bit. So that kind of that rebranding, reprinting of the business card exercise is one that we always try to keep an eye out. And don't get me wrong, bringing in additional headcount is never easy, but it can sometimes just dilute the benefit of it. If that isn't an option, there's potentially another one of the models that would be a better solution.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. Experience in this area, i.e. tech-led or tech-enhanced delivery of anything, in my context, legal services, is so important. Technology-centered projects, I think, go wrong probably more than any other kind, because there are so many stakeholders involved, not all of them talking the same language, not all of them, who work in culturally the same way. And if you were, for example, to approach a tech-led project with a pure legal mindset in terms of we're going to pay for a transaction, we'll carry out some DD, it may not go entirely to plan. Experience really counts in this field, like collateral, playbooks, checklists, all good stuff, but actually doing it and having done it for years is something that, like in almost any field, you can't really replace. I would just add one more thing, or one more sort of comment to this, which is one of the benefits, I think, of the siloed faithful model, that kind of slightly split out central team that operates and tries to serve the whole business, but without embedding them within certain teams, is that it has the ability to allocate resources to where the most busyness is. It has the ability to probably generate a pipeline more easily of people coming up through the team because it's larger and can generate and serve the business with that team. Where you've got an embedded expert model, you're typically seeing smaller pockets of teams in a business serving those individual practice groups in my example. And that means that it can be quite stop-start. You might have periods of busyness in that small team, followed by periods of less busy. That will affect the ability to market internally and to market externally, and to work on more than a few or even one major project at a time. So embedded expert models, I think, suffer inherently from a scalability issue because the size of the teams inherently will be smaller, and because you will find it harder to allocate resources from other embedded expert teams because they will be busy trying to meet their objectives within that team. So that's where sort of flavors of a centralized model, but still using the embedded expert approach, can get around that issue of scalability.
Mm-hmm. To build on that, one alternative that I have seen a couple of times in the industry is where the innovation team essentially moves into kind of the product team, for want of a better word. So, you have an embedded team that's working on something that's new, it hasn't existed before. They get it through proof of concept and get it to a point where it's starting to get traction within the market. Suddenly that innovation team isn't really an innovation team anymore. They're running this new product or service line business. They're a product team. So this is always an interesting point for a proposition, because what you sometimes find is like the personalities within that team shift. So actually, I want to work on new stuff. So you transition it to a different BAU function that's more into kind of running it. And provided it's got its own self-sustaining P&L and it's not being drip fed from a mothership somewhere else, it can kind of fly a little bit easier. So again, when you kind of approach this spin out part of the business, would be the one other version of this I've probably seen.
Yeah. So there you go, the embedded expert model. I hope that was interesting.
Yeah. It is my favorite. Favorite.
And me too. But it's important to bear in mind those challenges, because they can be solved. As you were saying, there's no pure application of any of these models. I think the important thing here, and maybe we can move to sort of a wrap up, Luke. Should we move to a wrap up?
Yeah, I can kind of summarize a little bit. So I think the reason that I'm a big fan of this particular one kind of comes back to one, Nile's focus on highly regulated industries. So essentially, if it's big, it's complex, it's very hard to unpick without being some form of subject matter or having access to some form of subject matter expertise, which is personally where I believe all of the kind of the great innovation of the next 10 years is probably going to happen. It's going to be in these services that are very big, cumbersome, but we all use them on a day-to-day basis, which is by nature makes them regulated. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunity within this, and this format gives a lot of organizations the best opportunity to crack those kind of wicked problems within it. Or let me correct that, crack those problems at scale. But yeah, it depends a little bit, as all of the other models do, on the specific context at any given point.
To wrap up then, so Luke and I have been talking about innovation functions as a critical factor in the success of an innovation strategy in a business. Can't underestimate the importance of how your innovation team or people tasked with innovation sit within the business and how they're organized within the teams within the business. And we've talked about the siloed faithful model. We talked about the speedboat and the gin palace extension of the speedboat model, and finally the embedded expert model. And we were keen to point out that there is no pure application of those models. They are just helpful labels to pull together characteristics of how a business might choose to do it. And of course, there is almost inevitably no best way. Each has its advantages and downsides, and the model that works best for a particular organization will depend on where it is on its innovation journey. But I think critically, the decision about what structure you use should be deliberate and based on your business context, your business culture, management buy-in, strategic objectives, and not just what is the easiest model to slot into what we already have. So I think we touched on this in the last sort of segment, but I think the winning formula for a sort of mature innovation function where you're trying to change the day-to-day in terms of how you are providing solutions in my business to clients, or trying to come up with innovative products and systems, is having the embedded expert model. So you've got that proximity of subject matter expertise with capabilities, with some degree of centralization, so that those embedded expert teams are not operating in strict pockets and they're actually able to allocate and share knowledge, collateral, systems, and approaches. So that would be my takeaway in terms of what I think is a winning formula for a business which is at a particular stage of its innovation journey. Luke, any sort of thoughts on that?
So I have seen and worked on all of them, and I don't want to give a politician's answer, but I do see merit in all of them. A couple of things that I have noticed over the years is like who likes each model would probably. So what I tend to find with the siloed faithful model tends to be like the fan of chief operating officers and chief financial officers, because it's relatively easy to operationalize, and you can kind of keep track of the budget without having to change too much about what you do. The embedded model I tend to see as a favor of kind of more innovative minded CEOs and CSOs that are kind of very, very focused on like the specific outcomes within it. The speedboat model is definitely the favorite of practitioners. So, if your strategy is around much as it is in kind of like the Silicon Valley worlds of, we need the best developers, we need the best designers, we need the best of the talent. Building this kind of small, Google style, cultural hub on the side where everyone gets free lunches, is, it has a draw. So again, but that can play into your strategy as an organization. From a practitioner who is working in highly regulated industries with, a lot of complexity in them, I definitely have a preference for that embedded talent model. So there's nothing quite like working with, a Gen AI specialist who also understands financial advice. That haven't worked with anyone in that space yet, but it's a matter of time. But that suddenly makes it like a completely different understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve, as well as the technology that you're using to solve it. So if you're listening or reading this and you're trying to make up a decision yourself, there's normally kind of four things that we would look at as part of this conversation. So first and foremost, as with all things in an organization, it really starts with leadership. So is the leadership team and strategy on board with fundamentally the process of innovation and trying to do something different than BAU? If you're growing very steadily with your business as usual model and you don't need to change things up, that's fair. Crack on. But again, if there's not that commitment there, it becomes, or at least that commitment to get to some proof of concepts in the first instance, you're probably not going to get much further than that. The next question we'd always ask is around the culture. So again, having done a lot of work in financial services, these tend to be fairly risk-averse organizations. So within your culture, if you need to change that behavior in order to take more risks or try new things, again, that starts with leadership, but that will also be a determining factor in which of these models you go with. Because if you can't overcome that cultural model, then suddenly things like the speedboat become the only option that you're going to have to get started. Next one is capability. So do you actually have access to the skills, expertise within technology, human-centered design, data, AI increasingly, to actually build, launch, and test these solutions to market? And then the fourth one, which we've talked about at length, having come up against it many times, is capacity. So do you actually have the remit and the resource to go after things that sit out of the business as usual sphere? And again, can you create that capacity or be comfortable about the things that you're not going to do in the BAU space to create that capacity? So those are probably the four lenses that we would look at if we're trying to help an organization pick out one of these.
Yeah, I think the difference between, I think you talked about, Luke, a person who's had their business card reprinted and someone who's able and enabled to drive change in the way that things are done has a lot to do with the teams that sit next door to that person in terms of actually doing the stuff that's going to make a difference in developing technology or mapping processes or testing systems. So talking about developers, system architects, data experts, business analysts, customer experience, user experience experts, all of those skill sets are ones that I use pretty much on a daily basis. And without those teams there, we're massively hamstrung in what we can develop and deliver both internally and for our clients. So if you're sitting there as an innovation expert or sort of deadly tasked with that, but you don't have these teams on speed dial or you don't have them at all, there's probably something, it's going to be massively limiting in the complexity and effectiveness, I think, of what is possible, even with the rise of low code, no code software and so on. So that would be something to make sure that is in place. And it takes time to set up an innovation function which is delivering change is something that does not happen overnight. I describe it as an ecosystem, and it takes time to grow and for those parts of the ecosystem to start to kind of really work and live together to be successful. And that requires, just experience, working together and learning how the bits of those teams fit together. I would also say that, management buy-in is essential because, Luke, as you were saying, this stuff is expensive. We've just talked about all these skill sets that are invaluable and indispensable part of this model working. That costs a lot of money. And then having innovation teams that could be doing BAU work represents an opportunity cost. So what are they doing that now is valuable enough to justify them not doing that BAU work? And unless that team is given the headspace and essentially the ring fence from that work, they're just going to slide back into that BAU world. So that then is talking about changing KPIs. What are you measuring the team's performance on? How is it different to how they were assessed before? Really important stuff. Go on.
I was going to say, I feel we've potentially been a little bit unfair to business as usual. So just to clarify for everyone, business for you as usual is important. It's normally the lifeblood that feeds innovation initiatives. We've done a lot of work where you can find actually like maybe your first step if you're trying to become more innovative is to review your BAU processes and work out where you can free up capacity within them. But yeah, this has to happen within a wider strategy. So again, if BAU isn't profitable enough to fund innovation, or um, you can't build efficiency into how you're currently doing things in order to free up that capacity. This conversation can become a little bit moot. But at the same time, I just wanted to get a line in at the end to say you still need to run your business before you start trying to change the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And innovation functions do not exist in isolation. They are in symbiosis with the core proposition that the business, the idea is that you're delivering efficiencies or winning more work through, from my side, through the combination of those skill sets. Again, if that radical collaboration mindset isn't instilled, again, it may struggle as a function. So I think we can wrap it up there, Luke. I mean, I've really enjoyed that conversation. It's been quite interesting for me to talk through the various models and examine my experience of the legal industry and how this is being done through those lenses. Have you got any wrapping up comments?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been super interesting to hear it from the legal perspective specifically as well, because as I say, we've worked in lots of industries, and it's interesting to see the crossover with your own. I think for anyone who's out there who's interested in finding out more or has any questions, both Hugo and my details will be available somewhere around this content. And yeah, we'd more than likely love to hear from you. Other than that, happy innovating.
Yeah. Happy innovating.